On a glittering wedding day in Charleston, a black beggar stands quietly by the church gates, ignored by all, and mocked by the bride herself. Laughter erupts as the bride hurls cruel words at him, humiliating him in front of her wealthy guests. What no one knows is that this beggar is Dr. Malcolm Reed, a billionaire neurosurgeon who vanished from the public eye after revolutionizing spinal surgery. And before the night is over, the same woman who spat insults at him will beg on her knees when he utters just one sentence: "I can make your father walk again." Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story already has your jaw dropping, hit that like button, because it's about to get intense. The sun hung high over Charleston, a perfect polished pearl in a sea of cloudless blue. It was the kind of day that wedding planners dreamed of, a day made for memories and expensive photographs. At the gates of the Whitmore estate, a sprawling testament to old money and new power, the air buzzed with the hum of luxury cars and the light, tinkling laughter of the city's elite. Men in tailored suits and women in vibrant silk dresses floated past the ornate iron gates, their voices a soft murmur of compliments and gossip. Champagne flutes clinked, tiny crystals catching the brilliant sunlight and scattering it like diamonds. This was Ava Whitmore's day. And everything, from the perfect weather to the imported flowers, was designed to reflect her vision of flawlessness. Standing just outside this bubble of perfection was a man who seemed to be its complete opposite. He was a shadow against the sun-drenched stone walls, a stark reminder of a world that this celebration was built to keep out. His clothes were a patchwork of faded grays and browns, worn thin at the elbows and knees. His face was lined with a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue, and his beard was untrimmed, flecked with gray. He held out a hand, not aggressively, but with a quiet, steady patience. His palm was calloused, his fingers slightly curled. He didn't speak unless spoken to, his eyes simply following the flow of guests, a silent observer at the edge of the feast. This was Dr. Malcolm Reed, though no one here knew him as anything more than a beggar. Most guests simply pretended he wasn't there. They turned their heads, adjusted their ties, or suddenly found something fascinating to say to their companions, creating a little wall of conversation that kept the man and his poverty at a safe distance. A few offered looks of pity, a quick downward glance before hurrying inside, their charity extending no further than a fleeting thought. Then, the main event arrived. A white limousine, so long it seemed to bend the light around it, purred to a stop before the gates. The chauffeur, immaculate in a crisp black uniform, hurried to open the rear door. From the cool, leather-scented interior emerged Ava Whitmore. She was a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown, a cascade of white silk and intricate lace that shimmered with every movement. Her hair was swept up in an elegant knot, and a diamond necklace glittered at her throat. She paused for a moment, letting the photographers capture her, a faint, practiced smile on her lips. As she turned to walk toward the entrance, her eyes landed on Malcolm. Her perfect smile faltered, replaced by a sneer of pure disgust. The line of her jaw tightened. She stopped dead in her tracks, her bridesmaids clustering behind her like a flock of colorful, nervous birds. "Seriously?" Ava's voice was sharp, cutting through the pleasant hum of the party. "Not on my wedding day. Not here." Malcolm's hand remained outstretched. He said nothing, his gaze calm and unwavering. This only seemed to fuel her anger. "What are you looking at?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Do you think you belong here? Look at yourself. You're filth." A few of the nearby guests stopped, their conversations dying on their lips. They watched, uncertain. Ava's bridesmaids began to giggle, a nervous, high-pitched sound that emboldened her. She took a step closer to Malcolm, her expensive perfume warring with the dusty air around him. "Security!" she called out, waving a hand dismissively. "Can someone please remove this beggar trash from my property? He's ruining the aesthetic." Two guards in dark suits began to move forward, their faces stern. Malcolm slowly lowered his hand. He looked at Ava, not with anger or shame, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. He bowed his head slightly. "May your marriage be blessed with happiness," he said softly. His voice was deep and steady, completely out of place with his ragged appearance. The simple, kind words seemed to enrage Ava more than any protest could have. It was as if his dignity was a personal insult to her. She let out a short, cruel laugh. Reaching into her small, beaded purse, she pulled out a single crumpled dollar bill. She held it up between two perfectly manicured fingers, as if it were something dirty. "You want a blessing?" she mocked, her voice dripping with contempt. "Here's $1. Crawl for it." She flicked the bill onto the dusty ground at his feet. It fluttered for a moment before settling near the toe of his worn-out boot. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was no longer just dismissal. It was a deliberate, calculated act of humiliation. The nervous giggles from her bridesmaids died away, replaced by an awkward silence. Even the most jaded of the guests shifted uncomfortably. A waitress named Lily, passing by with a tray of empty glasses, froze in place. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the crumpled bill on the ground, the bride's triumphant sneer, and the quiet stillness of the man. Shame washed over her, hot and sharp. She wanted to say something, to do something, but the fear of losing her job kept her feet glued to the spot. Malcolm did not look at the dollar. He simply looked at Ava, his eyes holding a profound and unnerving calmness. He did not seem broken or humiliated. He seemed patient. He slowly turned, preparing to walk away from the gate, from the wedding, from her. Seeing that her final act of cruelty had failed to shatter him, Ava needed to have the last word. Her voice followed him, loud and clear for everyone to hear. "That's right! Run away! You'll never be anything but a parasite feeding off the rest of us." She turned back to her friends, a victorious smirk on her face, completely unaware that she had just spit on the one man in the world who held her family's future in his hands. As Malcolm began to walk away, the jeers of the bride and the nervous laughter of her guests fading behind him, he took only 3 steps before stopping. He didn't turn around completely, just enough to look back over his shoulder. The unsettling composure that had so infuriated Ava was still there, a mask of perfect calm. But there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of something decisive, something powerful. The air around the gate, which had been thick with cruelty and awkwardness, suddenly grew still. Everyone's attention was fixed on the man in rags. He looked past Ava, his gaze locking onto a figure seated in a state-of-the-art wheelchair near the grand entrance of the house. Charles Whitmore, the patriarch, the retired CEO, the man whose fortune had paid for every petal and every pearl at this wedding. Then Malcolm spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried with an impossible weight, slicing through the air and landing like a physical blow. "I can make your father walk again." The words dropped into the silence, and the world seemed to stop. Ava's triumphant laughter died in her throat. A chilling stillness fell over the crowd. The nervous smiles vanished from the faces of the bridesmaids. The guests who had been trying to ignore the scene now stared, their mouths slightly agape. It was as if a spell had been cast. Ava was the first to break it. "What did you say?" she stammered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. From his wheelchair, Charles Whitmore went pale. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like parchment. His hands, which had been resting on the controls of his chair, clenched into tight fists. He pushed himself forward slightly, his eyes wide, fixed on Malcolm. "What did you mean by that?" Charles's voice was a low growl, filled with a desperate, hungry hope that he had long ago forced himself to bury. Ava quickly regained her composure, her face flushing with anger. She saw this not as an offer, but as a new, more audacious form of attack on her perfect day. "Don't listen to him, Daddy," she snapped, turning to her father. "He's a lunatic. He's just trying to scam us. Security, get him out of here, now." The two guards, who had paused during the strange exchange, started moving toward Malcolm again, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He ignored the advancing guards and kept his eyes on Charles. "I'm not asking for money," he said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'm offering a miracle." "Stop!" Charles's voice boomed across the manicured lawn. The command was sharp, filled with the authority of a man who had run a global empire. The guards froze in their tracks, hesitating. They looked from Charles to Ava, caught between two conflicting orders. A complete hush fell over the entrance. The only sound was the distant chirping of birds. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Ava was shaking with rage. "This is my wedding day. I will not have it ruined by some crazy, manipulative beggar. He's playing on your desperation, Daddy. Can't you see that?" Malcolm finally turned his full attention back to Ava. The look he gave her was not one of anger, but of deep, profound pity. It was a look that stripped away her Vera Wang gown, her diamonds, and her status, and saw only the small, bitter person underneath. "Your arrogance blinds you," he said, his voice soft but carrying an immense finality. "I pity you." And with that, he turned and walked away. He didn't hurry. His steps were measured and even. He disappeared down the tree-lined street, leaving behind a wake of confusion, fury, and a tiny, dangerous spark of hope. Ava stood trembling, her face a mask of incandescent rage. Her perfect day was fractured. A common beggar had stolen the spotlight and left her feeling exposed and powerless. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she knew on some deep, instinctual level that she had made a terrible mistake. Charles Whitmore watched the man go, his heart pounding in his chest. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 years was clawing its way to the surface. A fragile, terrifying hope. And Lily, the waitress, stood frozen by the tray stand, her mind replaying the man's words. She watched him walk away, a figure of quiet dignity, and a wave of shame washed over her again. Shame for her silence. Shame for being part of a world that could treat another human being with such casual cruelty. She didn't know who that man was, but she knew one thing for certain. The story of this wedding was no longer just about the bride. 5 years earlier, the name Dr. Malcolm Reed was spoken with a kind of hushed reverence in the halls of medicine. He wasn't just a neurosurgeon. He was a prodigy, a visionary. At the age of 32, he had become the youngest head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, a position typically held by men decades his senior. His hands were a miracle of nature, steady and precise, capable of navigating the delicate, treacherous landscape of the human spinal cord with an artist's grace. His true genius, however, lay not just in his skill, but in his revolutionary thinking. He saw problems others had accepted as unsolvable. While the world's best surgeons were refining existing techniques for spinal injuries, Malcolm was inventing a new one from scratch. He developed a micro-regenerative procedure that used a patented combination of bioscaffolding and targeted stem cell therapy to repair severed spinal nerves. It was the stuff of science fiction. The medical community was skeptical at first, calling it overly ambitious, even reckless. Then came the results. His first patient was a young firefighter paralyzed from the waist down after a building collapse. 6 months after Malcolm's procedure, the man took his first agonizing, miraculous steps. Then another patient, a teenage girl from a car accident, walked at her high school graduation. Dozens followed. The procedure, which he named the Reed method, had a staggering success rate. It wasn't a cure for all paralysis, but for a specific and devastating type of spinal cord injury, it was a miracle. Fame and fortune followed swiftly. The patents for his techniques and the biotech company he founded to develop the necessary equipment, Reed Neurosciences, made him a billionaire before he was 40. He was on the cover of medical journals and popular magazines. Hospitals around the world clamored for him. Wealthy donors threw money at his research. He was offered everything a man could want: prestige, power, and a seemingly endless supply of wealth. But the acclaim felt hollow. The more he was praised, the more disconnected he felt. He saw how people treated him now, with a sycophantic awe that bordered on worship. They hung on his every word, laughed at his weakest jokes, and cleared paths for him wherever he went. Yet he remembered a time not so long ago when he was just another black man, followed in stores, ignored by taxi drivers, and met with the low-grade persistent suspicion that was a constant companion for so many. The only thing that had changed was the size of his bank account. This disparity gnawed at him. He would leave a gala where a single plate of food cost more than a family's monthly rent, and see a homeless man shivering on the street corner just outside. The guests inside would talk about philanthropy and charity, writing large checks for tax deductions, but they would walk right past the man on the corner without a second glance, as if he were invisible. The hypocrisy was suffocating. He realized that society didn't value people. It valued power, status, and wealth. Haunted by this realization, he began to feel like a fraud. His work was about restoring human dignity, giving people back their lives. Yet the world he now inhabited seemed to be built on stripping it away from those who had the least. One day, after a particularly nauseating award ceremony, where a politician praised his work while simultaneously cutting funding for public health clinics, Malcolm made a decision. He had to understand. He had to see the world not from the top of the mountain, but from the bottom of the valley. So he vanished. To the world, Dr. Malcolm Reed simply retired from public life, citing a need for privacy to focus on research. His company continued to thrive under the leadership of his trusted chief of staff, Dr. Helena Cho, one of the few people who knew his secret. But Malcolm himself disappeared from the galas, the conferences, and the boardrooms. He began a new kind of research, a study not of the human spine, but of the human heart. He shed his tailored suits and expensive watches, and donned the uniforms of the invisible. He worked as a janitor in one of his own hospitals, listening to the way doctors and nurses spoke to the cleaning staff. He played a saxophone on a street corner, a busker watching who made eye contact and who hurried past. And sometimes, like today, he dressed as a beggar, a silent testament to society's failures, observing the raw, unfiltered truth of human nature. He chose Ava Whitmore's wedding deliberately. The Whitmores were the epitome of the world he had left behind, a family whose name was synonymous with influence and inherited arrogance. He had heard stories about Ava, her sense of entitlement, her casual cruelty to service staff. He came to see for himself if the stories were true. Ava's behavior hadn't surprised him. It was a textbook case of what he'd come to call status blindness, the inability of the privileged to see the humanity in those they deem beneath them. It was ugly and predictable. What had intrigued him, however, was the reaction of her father. While Ava saw a nuisance, Charles Whitmore had looked at him with something else. It wasn't pity. It was a flicker of something that looked like recognition, not of his face, but of his words, of the impossible hope they represented. In that one moment, Malcolm saw past the retired CEO and saw a man trapped, not just in a wheelchair, but in a prison of despair. It was in that moment he decided his experiment for the day was over. The observation phase was done. It was time to intervene. The last rays of the afternoon sun slanted through the tall, arched windows of the Whitmore estate, painting long golden stripes across the polished marble floors. The wedding ceremony was over, and the reception was in full swing. The sound of a live band drifted in from the garden, a smooth, jazzy melody that served as the soundtrack for an evening of relentless celebration. But inside the grand library, the atmosphere was anything but festive. Charles Whitmore sat in his wheelchair, his back to the room, staring out at the perfectly manicured rose garden. His tuxedo felt tight and restrictive. The joyful sounds from outside felt like a personal mockery. He hadn't moved from this spot for nearly an hour. The words of the man at the gate echoed in his mind, a relentless, torturous loop. I can make your father walk again." The library door opened and Ava swept in, her wedding dress rustling behind her. Her face was still flushed, but the initial shock had been replaced by a simmering, indignant anger. "There you are," she said, her voice sharp. "People are asking where you are. The father-daughter dance is supposed to be soon. We'll have to skip it, I guess." The last words were laced with a bitter, accusatory tone. Charles didn't turn around. "Find him," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ava scoffed. "Find who? That vagrant? Daddy, you can't be serious. He was a con artist, a lunatic. He saw a rich man in a wheelchair and tried to take advantage. It's disgusting." "He didn't ask for money," Charles said, his gaze still fixed on the garden. He remembered the man's eyes. There was no greed in them, no cunning. There was only a deep, unnerving calm. "Of course not." "That's how the scam works," Ava insisted, walking around to face him. "He preys on your emotions, gets you to trust him, and then he asks for a donation for his miracle cure. I've read about these people. He probably saw our wedding announcement in the paper and planned this whole thing." For 3 years, Charles had lived in a world without hope. Since the accident, a fall from a horse that had shattered 2 of his vertebrae, his life had become a series of consultations with grim-faced doctors. He had flown to clinics in Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. He had consulted with the best surgeons in the world. They had all said the same thing, in different, carefully padded words. The damage was too severe. The nerves were irrevocably severed. They could offer him pain management, physical therapy to maintain his upper body strength, and the most advanced wheelchair money could buy. But they could not offer him the one thing he craved more than his fortune: the ability to stand on his own 2 feet. He had eventually accepted it, or at least he had learned to pretend to accept it. He buried his despair under a veneer of stoicism. But the man at the gate, with his simple, impossible promise, had cracked that veneer. He had reached deep inside Charles and reawakened the desperate hope he thought he had killed long ago. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. "What if he wasn't lying?" Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper. He finally looked up at his daughter, and his eyes were pleading. "Ava, what if there's a chance? Even a 1 in a million chance?" Ava's face hardened. She saw his hope not as something to be nurtured, but as a weakness that reflected poorly on her. The beggar hadn't just embarrassed her. He had exposed a vulnerability in her father, and by extension, her family. It was unacceptable. "There is no chance," she said, her voice rising. "You've seen the best doctors in the world. Do you really think some filthy man on the street knows more than them? He disrupted my wedding. He humiliated me in front of all my friends. And now you're taking his side?" "This isn't about you, Ava," Charles said, his own anger beginning to surface. "This is about my life." "It's always about your life," she shot back. "Your accident, your recovery, your needs. For one day, I just wanted it to be about me, my perfect day, and you let him ruin it." The cruelty of her words struck Charles like a physical blow. He stared at his daughter, at the beautiful, selfish woman she had become. He had given her everything: the best schools, a limitless trust fund, a life free from hardship. And in doing so, he realized with a sickening clarity, he had failed to give her the one thing that mattered: compassion. His resolve hardened. He would not let this go. He wheeled his chair over to the large oak desk and pressed an intercom button. "Marcus," he said, his voice firm and clear, "come to the library, now." A moment later, the head of his security team, a tall, imposing man named Marcus, entered the room. "Sir?" "The man at the front gate earlier," Charles said, his eyes still locked on Ava. "The one Ms. Whitmore spoke to. I want you to find him. Use whatever resources you need. Check every shelter, every soup kitchen, every park in this city. I want him found. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said with a nod, then exited as quietly as he had entered. Ava stared at her father, her mouth agape. "I can't believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "You're choosing to believe a homeless nobody over your own daughter?" "Right now," Charles said, his voice cold as ice, "that homeless nobody is offering me more than you are." He turned his wheelchair and wheeled himself out of the library, leaving Ava standing alone in the middle of the room. Her perfect dress, a stark contrast to the ugly, bitter turmoil raging inside her. Her perfect day was in ashes, and her arrogance, the armor she wore against the world, was beginning to feel less like a shield and more like a cage. Lily Sanders untied the starched white apron and hung it carefully in her locker. Her shift was over, but the exhaustion she felt wasn't just physical. It was a deep moral weariness that had settled in her bones. All evening, as she served champagne and miniature quiches to the laughing guests, the image of the man at the gate had been burned into her mind. The sneer on Ava Whitmore's face, the crumpled dollar bill on the dusty ground, the man's quiet, unshakable dignity. Most of all, she was haunted by her own silence. She had stood there and done nothing. She told herself it was because she needed this job. She was working 2 of them to pay for her community college nursing prerequisites, but that excuse felt thin and cowardly. She knew in her heart that she had been afraid of Ava, afraid of losing her job, afraid of causing a scene, and the shame of that fear was a bitter taste in her mouth. As she was leaving through the service entrance, she overheard 2 of the security guards talking. "The old man's really serious about this," one of them said, shaking his head. "He's got us pulling surveillance footage from the street. Wants us to find some beggar." "What for?" the other asked. "Who knows? Said some crazy stuff to the bride, apparently. Something about making Mr. Whitmore walk again. Total nutcase, if you ask me." Lily's heart skipped a beat. So they were looking for him. A sudden, powerful impulse seized her. She had failed to act earlier, but maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could do something right. On instinct, while the scene at the gate had been unfolding, she had pulled out her phone, pretending to check a message. But she had actually snapped a quick, surreptitious photo of the man. It was a bit blurry, taken from a distance, but his face was clear enough. She had done it without really knowing why, perhaps as a way of bearing witness, of capturing the injustice in a way she couldn't with her voice. Now that photo felt like a responsibility. She knew she couldn't go to the police or the Whitmore's security. They would ask questions she couldn't answer. And besides, they saw him as a nuisance, a nutcase. They wouldn't approach him with the respect he deserved. She had to find him herself. She spent the next hour driving through the less glamorous parts of Charleston, her eyes scanning the sidewalks and parks. She showed the photo to a man running a hot dog stand to a woman waiting for a bus. No one recognized him. Dejection began to set in. The city was large, and he could be anywhere. Then she remembered something. There was a small park downtown, near a large church that ran a soup kitchen. It was a place where many of the city's homeless gathered for a bit of peace and quiet. It was a long shot, but it was her last idea. She found him sitting on a worn wooden bench under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. The sun had set, and the park was cast in the soft glow of streetlights. He wasn't alone. He was sharing a small bag of sandwiches with another man and a woman who were listening to him speak. His voice was calm and gentle. He wasn't preaching or lecturing. He was just talking, and they were listening with rapt attention. Lily's hands felt clammy. Her heart was pounding. She took a deep breath and walked toward the bench. As she got closer, the other 2 people saw her, and, seeming to sense this was a private matter, they nodded their thanks to Malcolm, took their sandwiches, and moved to another bench. Malcolm looked up at her as she approached. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet recognition. "Hello," he said simply. "Hi," Lily stammered, her voice feeling small. I was a waitress at the wedding today. I saw what happened. At the gate." He nodded, slowly waiting. The words tumbled out of her. "I'm so sorry. What she did, what she said, it was horrible. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I just stood there. I was afraid, and I'm so ashamed." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. A small, gentle smile touched Malcolm's lips. It transformed his weary face, giving it a warmth that was deeply comforting. "Fear is a powerful cage," he said, "but you're here now. That takes courage." His acceptance, his lack of judgment, made her feel even more emotional. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "Mr. Whitmore, Ava's father, he's looking for you. He sent his security team. He heard what you said." "I know," Malcolm replied. Lily hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind all evening. "Is it true, what you said to them? Can you really help him?" Malcolm's gaze became serious, his eyes holding a depth that seemed to contain a world of knowledge. He looked at her, and she felt as if he could see right into her soul, see her hopes and her struggles. "Yes," he said, the words simple, direct, and utterly convincing. "I can." A wave of relief and awe washed over Lily. It was true. He wasn't a madman or a con artist. He was something else entirely. "But," she started, a new confusion dawning. "Why did you let her treat you like that? Why didn't you tell them who you are?" Malcolm looked out at the dark park, at the distant lights of the city. "Sometimes people can't hear the truth until they are ready to listen. An arrogant heart is a deaf one." He turned his gaze back to her. "Mr. Whitmore might be ready to listen, but his daughter, she has a lesson to learn first, and I have a feeling it must be learned before any healing can begin." Lily understood. This wasn't just about a medical procedure. It was about something bigger. It was about justice, about humility, and she had somehow stumbled into the middle of it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "For now," he said, gesturing to the peaceful park around them, "I will rest, and I will wait for them to find me." He looked at her, his expression kind. "Thank you for coming, Lily. Your compassion is a rare and valuable thing. Don't ever be ashamed of it." Lily walked away from the park that night, feeling as if she had been fundamentally changed. The world felt different, bigger, filled with hidden meanings and secret truths. She didn't know the man's name, but she knew she had just met someone extraordinary. And she knew with absolute certainty that the Whitmore family was about to be shaken to its very core. The after-party was in full swing, a loud, glittering affair held in the estate's grand ballroom. A DJ played thumping electronic music, and strobe lights flashed across a dance floor crowded with laughing, drinking guests. Ava, having changed into a shorter sequined dress, was holding court in the center of the room, a champagne flute in her hand. The earlier incident at the gate had been a brief, ugly tear in the fabric of her perfect day, but she was determined to stitch it back together with defiance and alcohol. Her friends gathered around her, eager to hear the story, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. "I cannot believe that happened, Ava," said one of her bridesmaids, a woman named Chloe. "That man was so creepy." Ava took a long sip of her champagne and laughed, a sound that was a little too loud, a little too sharp. "Creepy? He was pathetic. Honestly, the nerve of some people. Trying to ruin my wedding day." "And what he said about your father," another friend added. "That was just evil, preying on him like that." "Oh, that was the best part," Ava said, a malicious glint in her eyes. She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "He actually pretended to be a doctor. Can you believe it? He stood there in his filthy rags and tried to convince us he had some miracle cure. She threw her head back and laughed again. Like, who does he think he is? Some kind of hidden genius? Please, the only thing he's a genius at is begging. The circle of friends laughed along with her, their sycophantic chorus fueling her performance. She felt powerful again, back in control. She was rewriting the narrative, turning her humiliation into a funny anecdote, a story of her triumph over a pathetic troublemaker. She was the hero who had put a beggar in his place. Just then, the ballroom doors opened, and she saw her father being wheeled in by an attendant. He had been absent for most of the evening, and his return cast a sudden pall over her mood. He wheeled himself over to the edge of her group, his face a thunderous mask of disapproval. The music was too loud for him to have heard exactly what she said, but the sight of her laughing and bragging, surrounded by her fawning friends, was enough. "Ava, a word," he said, his voice low and tight. Ava rolled her eyes dramatically for her friends to see before turning to her father with a saccharine smile. "Daddy, we're celebrating. Come, have some champagne." "I don't want champagne," he said, his voice cutting through her false cheer. "I want you to stop this. Stop talking about that man. Stop making a spectacle of yourself." Ava's smile vanished. "A spectacle? I'm the host of this party. I'm just telling a story. It was a crazy thing that happened. People think it's funny." "It's not funny, Ava," Charles snapped. "A man is in pain. A family is in crisis. And you turn it into a joke for your vapid friends. Have you no decency?" The word vapid hung in the air. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, their smiles frozen on their faces. Ava's face turned crimson. He had insulted her in front of them. "You're just too sentimental, Daddy," she retorted, her voice dripping with scorn. "You're so desperate you're willing to believe any lie. It's embarrassing." Charles stared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and deep, profound disappointment. He saw now that her arrogance wasn't just a youthful flaw. It was a rot that went to her core. She was incapable of empathy. She saw his pain only as an inconvenience, a blemish on her perfect life. Without another word, he turned his wheelchair around and had the attendant wheel him out of the ballroom. The doors closed behind him with a soft, final thud. The circle of friends was silent, avoiding her gaze. The moment had been ruined. The triumphant mood had evaporated, leaving behind a stale, awkward tension. Ava shrugged, trying to project an air of nonchalant confidence she no longer felt. "He's just tired," she said to the group, forcing a laugh. "The whole day has been a lot for him." But the lie was transparent. Her father's cold fury had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. What if she was wrong? What if there was more to the man at the gate than she had allowed herself to believe? She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. It was impossible. She was Ava Whitmore. She was never wrong. She raised her glass high. "To a perfect night," she declared, her voice a little too shrill. A few friends raised their glasses in a weak echo. But the party's energy had died. Her arrogance had won her the battle with the beggar. But she was beginning to feel like she was losing a much more important war. The next morning, the sun rose over a different Charleston. Not the Charleston of historic mansions and high society, but the Charleston of working-class neighborhoods, where the buildings were made of brick and the streets were lined with modest two-story homes. In a small, sparsely furnished apartment above a free health clinic, Malcolm Reed sat at a simple wooden table, sipping a cup of black coffee. The apartment was his sanctuary, a place of quiet and anonymity. The walls were lined with books, not medical texts, but works of philosophy, poetry, and history. There was no art on the walls, no expensive furniture. The only sign of his immense wealth was the high-tech encrypted satellite phone that sat on the table beside his coffee mug. This apartment and the clinic below it, which he secretly funded through a labyrinth of anonymous charitable foundations, was the heart of his real work. Here, he wasn't a billionaire or a beggar. He was just a man trying to make a small, meaningful difference. He picked up the satellite phone. It had only one pre-programmed number. He pressed the button and waited. After a single ring, a crisp, professional voice answered. Dr. Cho. Dr. Helena Cho was more than his chief of staff at Reed Neurosciences. She was his co-conspirator, his confidant, the fiercely loyal gatekeeper of his double life. She was a brilliant scientist in her own right and ran his billion-dollar empire with an efficiency that bordered on terrifying. Helena, Malcolm said, his voice calm. It's me. Malcolm, is everything all right? Your check-in was scheduled for this evening. Her voice was sharp with concern. Everything is fine. Better than fine, in fact. An opportunity has presented itself. I need you to prepare the facility. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The facility was their code for his private, state-of-the-art surgical center, a place so secret and exclusive it wasn't on any map. It was reserved for the most challenging cases, and for the pro bono work Malcolm still insisted on doing. A new patient? Helena asked, her tone shifting to one of pure professionalism. Potentially, Malcolm replied. His name is Charles Whitmore. I need a full medical workup on him. He had a spinal injury about 3 years ago. Equestrian accident. Get me every file, every scan, every doctor's report you can find. I want to know everything. Whitmore, Helena repeated. As in Whitmore Shipping? I'll have it on your encrypted server within the hour. Is there anything else? Yes, Malcolm said, a faint smile playing on his lips. We may have a guest soon. It's a delicate situation. He will likely be brought in by his own people. Make sure the staff is discreet. Of course, Malcolm, always. Thank you, Helena. He ended the call and set the phone down. The first piece was now in place. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus, the head of the Whitmore security team, was finally closing in. After a night of dead ends, a tip from a street vendor who recognized the photo Lily had been showing around led them to the park. From there, they used footage from a traffic camera to track the man to a bus stop, and then to this quiet, unassuming neighborhood. 2 black SUVs pulled up silently in front of the free clinic. Marcus and 3 of his men, all dressed in discreet dark suits, got out. They didn't storm the building. Charles's orders had been clear. Be respectful, be cautious. Marcus entered the clinic. A nurse at the front desk looked up. Can I help you? I'm looking for a man, Marcus said, showing her the photo on his phone. He may be staying nearby. The nurse looked at the photo, then her eyes widened slightly in recognition, but she shook her head. I'm sorry, I can't help you. We have to respect the privacy of our patients and the people in this community. Marcus knew he couldn't force the issue. He thanked her and walked back outside, frustrated. As he was about to tell his men to start a door-to-door search, the front door of the apartment above the clinic opened. Malcolm Reed walked down the exterior stairs. He was wearing the same simple, clean clothes from the day before, jeans and a plain t-shirt. He looked directly at Marcus. You've been looking for me, he said. It wasn't a question. Marcus and his men were taken aback by his directness. They had expected to be chasing a transient, not to be met by a man who seemed to be waiting for them. Mr. Charles Whitmore would like to speak with you, Marcus said, his voice formal. Malcolm nodded slowly. I'm willing to meet with him. Relief washed over Marcus's face. This was going to be easier than he thought. Excellent. We can take you to the estate right now. I have one condition, Malcolm said, his voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Name it, Marcus replied. The meeting must take place at his estate, as you suggest, Malcolm said. But his daughter, Ava, must be present as well, both of them. Together. Marcus was confused by the request, but his orders were to secure the meeting, not to question the terms. I will pass that along to Mr. Whitmore, he said. Do that, Malcolm replied. I'll be waiting here. He turned and walked back up the stairs to his apartment. leaving Marcus and his team standing on the sidewalk, feeling as though they hadn't found their target, but that their target had allowed himself to be found. The power dynamic was all wrong, and Marcus had the unsettling feeling that they were no longer in control of the situation. The air in the Whitmore library was thick with tension. Charles sat in his wheelchair behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Ava stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of sullen resentment. She hadn't wanted to be here. She had only agreed to attend after her father had threatened to freeze her credit cards. The idea that this beggar, this nobody, was making demands of them was infuriating. The library doors opened and Marcus escorted Malcolm into the room. He was still in his simple, clean clothes, a plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans. He looked completely out of place in the opulent room, with its leather-bound books, antique globe, and oil paintings of long-dead Whitmores. Yet, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that seemed to dominate the space. He gave a slight nod to Charles, and then his eyes met Ava's. She glared back at him, her disdain palpable. Marcus closed the doors, leaving the three of them alone. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken by Charles, his voice strained. "Thank you for coming," he said. Malcolm inclined his head. "You wanted to speak with me." "Yes," Charles said, leaning forward. He got straight to the point. "Yesterday at the gate you said you could make me walk. I need to know. Were you telling the truth?" Malcolm's gaze was direct and unblinking. "Yes." The single word spoken with such absolute certainty sent a jolt through Charles. He felt that dangerous spark of hope ignite again, brighter this time. Ava let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, please, you can't possibly believe this. He's a fraud, Daddy. He's going to ask for money. Just watch." Malcolm turned his attention to her. "I have not asked for money," he said calmly. "Not yet," she retorted. "But you will. That's the game, isn't it? Give us this big, impossible promise, get our hopes up, and then hit us with the price tag for your miracle cure." Charles ignored her. He was focused entirely on Malcolm. "How?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "How is it possible? I've seen the best doctors in the world. They all said the damage was permanent." "The doctors you saw were likely working with established conventional methods," Malcolm explained, his voice taking on a slightly more clinical tone. "They are skilled, but they are limited by the tools they have. There are other methods, experimental, revolutionary procedures that aren't widely available." Ava scoffed. "And you, a man who lives on the street, just happens to be an expert in these revolutionary procedures? What a coincidence." Malcolm didn't rise to the bait. He kept his focus on Charles. "I can explain the science behind it, but it's complex. What you need to know is that there is a path to recovery. It's difficult, it's not guaranteed to be a 100% success, but it is possible." Charles felt a tear trace a path down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe so badly. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Name your price." This was the moment Ava had been waiting for. She smirked, a triumphant "I told you so" look on her face. Now the truth would come out. But Malcolm shook his head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Whitmore." He then turned, and for the first time he addressed Ava with a cold, hard finality. "But I do want something. Before we discuss any medical procedure, before I lift a single finger to help your father, there is one thing that must happen first." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "Your daughter," he said, his eyes locking onto Ava's, "owes an apology." The demand hung in the air, stunning both Charles and Ava into silence. Ava was the first to recover. A wave of indignant fury washed over her. An apology, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You want me to apologize to you? You've got to be kidding me. This is extortion. This is blackmail. I am not asking for money or property, Malcolm replied, his voice remaining level, which only infuriated her more. I am asking for a simple acknowledgement of decency. You humiliated a human being for your own amusement. You treated another person as if they were less than nothing. That is an arrogance I cannot abide. He turned back to Charles. My work is about restoring dignity. I will not, under any circumstances, perform it for the benefit of those who so casually strip others of theirs. The condition is simple. A genuine, heartfelt apology from your daughter. Not to me, but for her actions. Never, Ava shouted, her face contorted with rage. I will never apologize to you. Malcolm's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this. Then I'm afraid we have nothing more to discuss. He looked at Charles, and for a fleeting moment Charles saw a look of genuine sympathy in the man's eyes. I am sorry for your situation, Mr. Whitmore. Truly. But my principles are not for sale. Charles was torn. His only hope, the first glimmer of light he'd seen in 3 years, was standing right in front of him, and the price was an apology from his proud, stubborn daughter. He looked at Ava, her face a mask of defiant fury, and he felt a crushing sense of despair. He had a choice to make, his chance to walk or his daughter's pride. Get out, Ava spat at Malcolm. Get out of my house. Malcolm looked once more at Charles, then turned and walked toward the library doors. As his hand touched the handle, he paused and said, without turning around, The offer stands. But it will not stand forever. When you are ready to choose compassion over pride, you know how to find me. Then he was gone, leaving a father and daughter alone in a room filled with the deafening silence of a terrible, impossible choice. Days turned into a week. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over the Whitmore estate. Charles and Ava barely spoke. He spent his days in the library, staring out the window, lost in a torment of hope and frustration. Ava, for her part, tried to pretend that life was normal, but the confrontation had unsettled her. The man's quiet certainty, his refusal of money, his demand for an apology, it didn't fit the narrative of a simple con artist. A sliver of doubt had been planted in her mind, and it was beginning to grow. Finally, Charles decided to force the issue. He couldn't let it go. He told Ava that he was arranging a formal meeting. He was inviting the man to the headquarters of Whitmore Shipping to present a funding proposal for his supposed procedure. It was a strategic move. He wanted to see how the man would behave in a corporate environment, a world of power and scrutiny. He also hoped that the formal setting would intimidate him, perhaps force him to reveal his true, fraudulent intentions. Ava agreed to come, a smug sense of anticipation building within her. This was it. This was the final act. She imagined the beggar completely out of his depth, stammering and sweating under the questioning of her father's board members and lawyers. She would be vindicated. Her father would finally see that she had been right all along. She pictured the man shuffling into the gleaming glass and steel boardroom in his tattered clothes, a pathetic figure about to be exposed. She arrived at the Whitmore Shipping headquarters deliberately late, wanting to make an entrance. She strode into the top-floor boardroom, a chic, minimalist space with a panoramic view of the Charleston harbor. Her father was already there, at the head of a long, polished obsidian table. Seated around him were the company's top executives and a team of lawyers. The atmosphere was serious and expectant. There was an empty chair beside her father, and another one for the guest at the far end of the table. "Sorry I'm late," Ava said, breezing in. "Has our special guest arrived yet? Or did he finally realize the gig was up and decide not to show his face?" She smiled, expecting appreciative chuckles. Instead, she was met with a tense silence. All eyes were on the door. "He's on his way up," Charles said, his voice grim. Ava took her seat, smoothing down her designer dress. a confident smirk playing on her lips. She was ready for the show. The boardroom doors swung open. Ava looked up, her smirk widening, ready to see the beggar she had mocked at her gate. And then her world tilted on its axis. The man who entered was not the man she was expecting. He was tall and carried himself with an effortless authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a simple, elegant silk tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His face was the same, but it was clean-shaven now, revealing a strong, intelligent jawline. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He was not alone. Flanking him were two other people. On his right was a woman with sharp, intelligent features, dressed in a power suit and holding a tablet. On his left was a silver-haired man carrying a leather briefcase who radiated the quiet confidence of a high-powered attorney. Ava's smirk vanished. Her jaw dropped. A cold, prickling sensation washed over her skin. It was him. It was the same man, but it was also a complete stranger. The man walked to the head of the table opposite her father. His team took their places behind him. He placed his hands on the back of the chair and surveyed the room, his calm gaze passing over the shocked faces of the executives, over her father's stunned expression, and finally settling on her. Ava felt the blood drain from her face. Her mouth went dry. Her mind was screaming, "Impossible, impossible, impossible." Charles was the first to find his voice, though it was weak with disbelief. Who are you?" The man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. He pulled out the chair and sat down, a king taking his throne. "My apologies for the confusion," he said, his voice the same deep, steady tone she remembered, but now it was imbued with an undeniable power. He looked directly at Charles, then at Ava, and then at the rest of the silent, gaping room. "My name," he said, letting each word land with deliberate weight, "is Dr. Malcolm Reed. I am the founder and chief researcher of Reed Neurosciences. I am also the patent holder for the Reed method for spinal nerve regeneration, and the majority owner of 4 private surgical hospitals." He paused for a beat, letting the information sink in. "And you may have heard of me." The room fell into a silence so profound it was almost deafening. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping of Ava's own heart. Dr. Malcolm Reed. The name echoed in her memory. A genius, a recluse, a billionaire surgeon. The man her father's own doctors had spoken of with awe. The one man they had said might have been able to help, if only he hadn't vanished from the world years ago. Ava stared at him, her vision blurring. The beggar, the parasite, the filth. It was all a lie. She hadn't been punching down at a powerless man. She had been spitting in the face of a giant, and he had let her. He had stood there and taken it all, his quiet calm a mask for the immense power he held. The full, horrifying weight of what she had done crashed down upon her. The humiliation she had inflicted was nothing compared to the humiliation she now felt. She was the fool, she was the joke, and her perfect world, the one she had built on a foundation of wealth and arrogance, had just been shattered into a million pieces. Dr. Malcolm Reed remained seated, the calm center of the storm he had created. He gestured to the woman standing behind him, Dr. Helena Cho. "Dr. Cho, if you would." Helena nodded, and with a few taps on her tablet, a large screen on the boardroom wall lit up. The Reed Neurosciences logo appeared, sleek and authoritative. "As I mentioned," Malcolm began, his voice even and measured, "I am a neurosurgeon. For the past decade, my work has focused exclusively on catastrophic spinal cord injuries, specifically those previously deemed irreparable by the medical community." A series of images flashed across the screen. Complex neurological diagrams, 3D models of the human spine, and then photos Photos of people in wheelchairs, their faces etched with despair. They were followed by videos. A young woman, once paralyzed, taking her first steps between parallel bars, tears of joy streaming down her face. An elderly man told he would never leave his bed again, standing up to hug his grandchild. Dozens of them, each one a documented, verifiable miracle. The Reed method, Malcolm explained, is a two-stage procedure that involves the implantation of a proprietary bioscaffolding matrix followed by a targeted regimen of autologous stem cell injections. In layman's terms, we create a bridge for severed nerves to regrow and reconnect. The success rate in qualified patients is approximately 87%. The executives and lawyers around the table stared, mesmerized and stunned. They had come expecting to debunk a charlatan. Instead, they were receiving a masterclass from a living legend. Charles Whitmore looked as if he had seen a ghost. All the articles he had read, all the specialists he had consulted, the name Reed had come up, but always as a ghost, a pioneer who had disappeared. And he had been standing at the gates of his own home. Malcolm's presentation continued, calm, clinical, and utterly devastating to Ava's worldview. He showed them financial statements for his company, a global biotech empire worth billions. He showed them the patents for his surgical techniques, ironclad and world-renowned. He laid out the truth of his identity, piece by undeniable piece, until there was no room left for doubt. Then the presentation ended. The screen went dark. Malcolm folded his hands on the table and looked around the room. "And that brings me to my final point," he said, his tone shifting from clinical to deeply personal. "I imagine some of you are wondering why. Why a man of my means would choose to dress in rags and stand outside a wedding, asking for change." He paused, and his eyes found Ava's again. She wanted to look away, to run, to disappear, but his gaze held her pinned to her chair. "For the past 5 years," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I have been conducting a social experiment. I wanted to see the world not through the lens of a billionaire, but through the eyes of the invisible, the forgotten, the people that society steps over and pretends not to see. I wanted to understand the nature of human compassion when stripped of status and power." He leaned forward slightly. "And what I have learned is this. A person's true character is not revealed in how they treat their equals or their superiors. It is revealed in how they treat those they believe have nothing to offer them. It is in those moments that the soul is laid bare." He was no longer speaking to the room. He was speaking directly to her. "Arrogance," he said, the words hitting her like stones, "is a greater paralysis than any spinal injury. It cripples the soul. It blinds you to the humanity of others. It was my hope that by offering a miracle, I could also offer a lesson." He turned his gaze to Charles. "The offer I made in your library still stands, Mr. Whitmore. I will perform the procedure on you. My fee, however, remains the same. Not a single dollar of your money. Just a single act of genuine humility from your daughter." The power dynamic had not just flipped. It had been utterly annihilated. Ava was no longer the powerful heiress looking down on a beggar. She was a small, cruel girl, being held accountable for her actions by a man who held her father's entire future in his hands. The boardroom was silent, but for Ava, it was filled with the deafening sound of her own arrogance crumbling to dust. She was speechless, stripped bare in front of her father and his entire company, exposed for exactly what she was. The story of the billionaire beggar who held the key to Charles Whitmore's recovery became an overnight sensation. It was the kind of tale that seemed tailor-made for the viral age. A journalist who had been a guest at the wedding wrote a scathing first-hand account of Ava's cruelty at the gate, and the article spread like wildfire. Soon, news outlets across the country picked it up. Dr. Malcolm Reed, the reclusive genius, was back in the public eye, and his re-emergence was tied to an incredible story of humility and hubris. The backlash against Ava was immediate and brutal. The video that someone had discreetly filmed of her mocking Malcolm and throwing the dollar at his feet surfaced online. It was played on national news, replayed in endless loops on social media. She became a symbol of privileged arrogance. Hashtags like #Ava, the awful, and #Whitmore shame trended for days. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of prestige, was now associated with public disgrace. The guests who had laughed along with her at the wedding were now falling over themselves to distance themselves from her. They gave interviews talking about how shocked and uncomfortable they had been. Men and women who had ignored Malcolm at the gate now claimed they had always felt a special presence about him. The hypocrisy was thick, but it served its purpose: to isolate Ava as the sole villain of the story. The board of Whitmore Shipping, facing a public relations nightmare and plummeting stock prices, went into damage control. Charles, in a move that was both a father's heartbreak and a CEO's cold calculation, issued a formal public apology on behalf of his family and his company. He announced a multi-million-dollar donation to a network of homeless shelters, a network that, unbeknownst to him, was secretly managed by one of Malcolm's foundations. But it wasn't enough. The pressure mounted. A week after the boardroom reveal, Ava was forced to step down from her high-paying, largely ceremonial position as vice president of marketing at the family company. Her social life evaporated. Invitations were rescinded. Friends stopped returning her calls. She became a pariah, trapped in the gilded cage of the family estate, forced to watch as the world celebrated the man she had called trash. In the midst of this public reckoning, a quieter, more meaningful story was unfolding. Malcolm Reed had not forgotten the one person who had shown him kindness when he had nothing to offer. He sent a representative to find Lily Sanders. Lily was at her second job, waitressing at a small diner, when a woman in a sharp business suit walked in and asked for her by name. It was Dr. Cho. Lily was terrified, assuming she was in some kind of trouble for her involvement. Instead, Helena handed her a thick envelope. "Dr. Reed was moved by your compassion," Helena said, her expression softening. "He believes people who act with integrity, especially when it's difficult, should be rewarded." Lily opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter. It informed her that a full 4-year scholarship had been established in her name at the Medical University of South Carolina's College of Nursing. All her tuition, books, and living expenses would be paid for. It was a gift that would change the entire trajectory of her life. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she read the letter. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation. It was the knowledge that her small act of decency, of simply seeing another person's humanity, had been noticed. "Please," Lily said, her voice choked with emotion. "Please tell him thank you. He has no idea what this means." "Oh, I think he does," Helena replied with a small smile. "Dr. Reed understands the value of a compassionate heart better than anyone." While Ava's world was crumbling, Lily's was just beginning to be built. The story had found its hero and its villain. Justice, in its own way, was being served. One woman was brought low by her arrogance, while another was lifted up by her kindness. The lesson Malcolm had set out to teach was resonating far beyond the Whitmore family. A powerful reminder that, in the end, it is our character, not our status, that defines our worth. Weeks later, in the sterile, quiet halls of Malcolm's private surgical clinic, the final act of the drama was set to unfold. The clinic was less like a hospital and more like a futuristic wellness retreat, with clean lines, minimalist art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a serene garden. Charles Whitmore was prepped for surgery. He was nervous, but beneath the fear was a current of profound, electrifying hope. Ava sat by his bedside, a shadow of her former self. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by weeks of public shame and private reflection. She was pale and quiet, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She had given her apology. It hadn't been in front of cameras or lawyers. It had been a private, broken, tearful confession to Malcolm in a small consultation room. She had apologized not just for her actions at the gate, but for the person she had become. Malcolm had accepted it with his usual quiet grace. The first step to healing for anyone, he had told her, is acknowledging the wound. Now, as the orderlies came to wheel her father to the operating room, Ava grabbed his hand. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you too," he said, squeezing her hand tightly. The surgery lasted for 9 hours. Malcolm and his team worked with a focused, silent intensity. It was a delicate dance on the microscopic edge of life, a painstaking process of rebuilding what had been broken. Ava and Lily, who Malcolm had invited to be there, waited together in a private lounge. They sat in a strange, shared silence, two women from different worlds, brought together by the actions of one extraordinary man. Finally, a weary but smiling Malcolm emerged from the surgical wing. He looked at Ava and Charles. "It went as well as we could have possibly hoped," he said. "The rest is up to him. And time." The next few weeks were an agony of slow, incremental progress. Physical therapy was grueling. There were days of frustration and despair when Charles was convinced the surgery had failed, but Malcolm and the therapists were relentless in their encouragement. Then, one afternoon, it happened. As Charles stood supported by parallel bars, his legs trembling with effort, he felt a flicker, a tiny, undeniable muscle contraction in his left thigh. It wasn't much, but it was everything. From that day on, the progress was steady. The flickers became twitches, the twitches became movements, and the movements became strength. 6 weeks after the surgery, the day of truth arrived. Malcolm, Ava, and Lily stood in the physical therapy room. Charles was positioned between the parallel bars, his face beaded with sweat, his expression a mixture of terror and determination. "You're ready, Charles," Malcolm said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Just like we practiced. Your body remembers how to do this. You just have to trust it." Charles took a deep, shaky breath. He let go of the bars. For a terrifying second, he wobbled, his legs shaking violently. Ava let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. And then he took a step. It was awkward, unsteady, more of a lurch than a walk, but it was a step. His foot had left the ground and moved forward under its own power. He took another, and another. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat. He was walking. He was actually walking. He stumbled across the short distance to his daughter and collapsed into her arms, sobbing with a joy so profound it was painful. Ava held him, her own tears soaking the shoulder of his shirt. She looked over her father's shoulder at Malcolm, her eyes filled with a gratitude that no words could ever express. Later that day, as Charles rested, Ava found Malcolm looking out at the clinic's garden. "Dr. Reed," she began, her voice soft. He turned to her. "Malcolm, please." "Malcolm," she said, trying the name on her tongue. "Thank you for everything, not just for my father, but for me." She looked down at her hands. "You were right. I was paralyzed. I was so trapped in my own pride and selfishness I couldn't see anything else. You didn't just give my father his legs back. You gave me a chance to find my soul." Malcolm nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "Redemption is a long road, Ava. But you've taken the first step, and that is often the hardest one." The story closes with a scene that would soon go viral itself, a grainy cell phone video taken by Lily. In it, Charles Whitmore, with the help of a simple cane, walks slowly but steadily across the room. Jaws drop. Tears flow. And Ava, standing by his side, is no longer the arrogant bride, but a humble daughter, watching a miracle unfold. She had learned the most painful and most valuable lesson of her life. How we treat those we think are beneath us is the truest measure of who we are. Arrogance cripples the soul more than any injury. Respect every person, for you never know whose hand holds the power to change your fate. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.